Hey guys, welcome to Joe's Java Studio. In the last video, we covered how to take request parameters from an HTTP request through the @request_param annotation. And today we'll be talking about another way of taking input data or input variables from the path itself. So today we'll be just using the post services find by ID method again. So here we pass in the ID, and then our REST client uses that ID to make a GET request to this endpoint and then this URI to retrieve a post of the specific ID. But the only thing different will be that we're not using @request_param, we'll be using @path variable. So let's go ahead and implement the controller method. So we can just do @get mapping, and then the path will be the path will have an ID in itself. And then this will return a post, and then we'll name this method find by path variable ID. All right, and then we'll annotate this parameter with the path variable integer ID. So what this is just doing, it's looking for a variable in the path of the request that's coming called ID, which I identified here. And then it'll automatically get that ID, so we can just pass that in to our post service method. Post service find by ID. Okay, that is a simple mapping using path variable. So you're not getting it from request parameters, you're getting it from the path itself. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, and here we have a posts.http file that we can use to send requests to. So here we're hitting our controller endpoint, and then this will be the path variable that the Spring application will pick up. So here we're getting an ID 1, and then the post data for ID equals 1. So that's how you pick up information from path variables. But let's say the path variable and then the method parameter name you want to differentiate. So let's name this post ID. Then this annotation will look for a path variable called post ID. But since we don't have that in the path, we can just do pass in the default variable name in the path. So this will now look for the variable called ID instead of post ID. So let's go ahead and run that again. And then we send another request. Let's make that 2. Yep, it's working. And let's create a dummy method just to explore different features of this @path variable annotation. So we'll do get mapping. So now path variable can also take multiple variables. So let's do /ID and then /name. All right, let's say you need in your request ID and name of something. So we'll just return a string here. Find by ID, name, and name. do path variable, integer ID, and then another path variable, string name. Then we'll just print this. We'll just return a string. ID is ID. Name will be name. Okay, so this will simply just return a string that tells you what the ID and name is in the path variables. So that's running. So if you do ID and then name, will pass in Joe. Now it returns the string that we made in the controller method right here. Okay, you can also map every path variable into a map, just like how you can do that with request parameters. And then we'll just name the path variable map. Oops. And then here we'll just have to change it to something like path variable map dot get ID. Then path variable map dot get name. This will be useful if you have more than multiple path variables that you're picking up. So let's test that. Actually, let's just print out the whole map. So we can do something like return path variable map dot toString. So this will print out the whole map. And now we have a map of all our path variables. All right. Another thing you can do with path variables is you can have optional path variables. So if, let's say, we have an endpoint that just picks up an ID, if that's optional, some clients may pass it in, some may not. So the request can either look like that, or like that. So we need to take into account both of these paths. So your path will look something like this. So it can just be an empty path. Let's name this optional. So we can have an empty path of optional, or we can have an ID that's passed in. So the request will actually look like something like optional. And this is, you don't have to have this endpoint. I'm just making an extra endpoint so none of my existing endpoints collide with each other. Get mapping. Yep, you have to pass in the value of all the paths. And then this will return a string. Return optional ID. And then it will take a path variable of, you can make this an optional string ID. Let's make that an integer because we've always said ID is an integer for this video. And then we'll do if ID dot is present, then we'll return ID plus ID dot get. Else we'll return ID is missing. All right. So let's go ahead and test that out. Right. So if we send here, no ID is passed in the path, so it'll say ID is missing. But if we do pass an ID, it'll say ID equals 2. So that's how you implement optional path variables. Okay. And then with this, you can also define a default value, let's say. So in this case, if ID is missing, you can just say ID default ID or something, or you can have a variable named int result ID, and then you can do result ID equals ID dot get, since we have an ID variable that's present, and you can just do result ID equals let's say default ID is 0. Okay, and then we can get rid of these return statements. Actually, we don't need, we'll just set it here. We don't need the else statement. And then now we can do return ID result ID. Okay. So now instead of saying ID is missing, we're setting the default resulting ID to 0. So if it passes in the ID, it'll still say the ID, but if you don't pass it, it'll say 0, which is what we set it as default to. All right, that's it on path variables. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.